Okay, so in this video, this is gonna be a little bit different, but a much needed video in a sense that walk with me on this journey of creating a CRM system. I know you can buy a bunch of these off the shelf, so why in the world would we build one? And it's not necessarily the CRM system, but it's the process of creating any Power Platform solution and some of the fundamentals you should think through. With my background as a solution architect, one that came from the help desk to a junior developer, senior developer, and now a solution architect, I've learned a lot along the way. And with these modern tools, some of those same skills that we used to use in .NET and custom development or pro development with Angular or React or pure C# and .NET Core and so on and so forth, those same fundamentals apply here, just from a solution, reusability, entity diagrams. So if you're building a meaty Power Platform solution, these are some of the key fundamentals you should absolutely consider. Even if it's a small, sizable Power Platform solution, there are definitely some key fundamental items that should carry on regardless of the Power Platform or regardless of the size or the complexity of the solution. So in here, if you can see my screen, I have a bunch of wireframes here. So we have a wireframe to capture the client information to feed into our CRM. You will also notice that I have a multi-form solution. So we'll talk through the strategy of that and actually the build. So everything that you see here that we're designing, we're actually going to implement and build over a series of video. Here you notice that there's a gallery. Look how fancy this gallery is. I mean, you have a mix of photos and titles and links to go into the details of each one of these items. There's a nice modal box. These modal or dialogue boxes, there's many different strategies on how to pull this off. I would find the one that I think is reusable, kind of elegant in that sense, to where you can apply these anytime a dialogue is needed. And then we have a commenting system. This is one of those items to where you have a flavor of this out of the box, but it doesn't have all the hooks needed to leverage the commenting capabilities on the list or commenting capabilities on the document library. So here we're going to roll out our own, and then we'll talk about how to put that in. Do you need a separate list for this, or do you store it in JSON within the same list item? A lot of those architectural scalable decisions you have to kind of think of up front. And here we talk through, I love this diagram. So in this, you actually, we will go through the details of this, of why when you're using this technology profile, some of the do's and don'ts you should do. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And I go through the rationale of why you should do one way versus the other. Again, this is, pretty action-packed strategy or solution video. Again, it's a little bit different than some of my other videos, but much needed when you're building solutions, especially if you're part of an enterprise and you want to build things that are reusable, or if you want to make sure you're building things right so you're not painting yourself in the corner, or really just what are some of the best practices, what are some of the things you should consider. We're going to go through a lot of that in this video. Let's get started. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to build this client relationship solution. So just imagine that Tesla has a list of clients that purchased their vehicle, and we want to capture information very similar to a CRM. So obviously a company the size of Tesla will have an enterprise grade CRM, but if we wanted to build something that just mimic the high level requirements of a CRM, this is what that solution will look like. And so basically what you see here, we're going to have a form that's going to capture the information. And here, once I get to the solution diagram screen, you will see how we're going to have multiple actors using this solution that may actually have multiple entry points. I think this is going to be a really good video series on Power Apps because we're going to do some very interesting things. So this left bullet point or guided navigation is going to be a Power App component. And, this solution is going to require multiple screens. So we get to see how to leverage a component across multiple screens and the benefit and value that brings to the table. We have a standard form. This is something that, especially if you've been following my videos, we do a lot of which capturing information, which is probably one of the core responsibilities of Power Apps is just to capture the information, then you kind of route it once it's kind of saved to a data source, and then you route it with Power Automate. So we're going to talk about using the form component, which I love, versus individual components, which I know some of us still practice, but I think the form component just has a much better maintenance story, so we'll walk through that. You will notice that I have this cancel and next, so this next is going to pop me to this next screen. You can see how that navigation just kind of highlights as you kind of go through there. And on this screen, this is going to be a separate screen, another form, right? And once you look at the list schema, you can see how all these columns are all part of the same record, but we're going to break it up just from a user experience perspective. So this is going to be a multi-screen, multi-form solution with a nice next. This actually should be previous, sorry. So with a nice, previous next navigation structure, as well as we're going to make these linkable. So at any given time, you don't have to go through this series to get the history. You can just come here and click on it. So we're going to walk through that. Then you're going to get to this vehicle section. And again, this is for this particular client, all the types of vehicles that they own. If you're talking to a sales rep or maybe they purchased a vehicle, this is where we add it to their profile. So the client can be self-service in a sense and be able to manage any one of these vehicles, either through managing payments on their vehicle, or maybe buying accessories for the vehicle, or even requesting service for a particular vehicle. So this is where things are going to be added. And then the client can actually add a new vehicle. You will see here in this screen, we're going to talk through how do you create this dialogue experience within Power Apps and then have it update information. And then we'll talk about histories or comments. This is another common scenario that you find yourself having to implement using Power Apps because, with most of these solutions, you want some type of history, either a commenting mechanism or feature to where, you're grabbing all the comments for this particular Power App, or it could be a log, activity log. So, say for example, if the client is interacting with their profile and they're changing the address or they're updating contact information, maybe we will log that information here, as well as a conversation that a customer service rep may have had with the client, or any service requests that the client may have dealt with at the dealership level. So again, just a nice running log in history that anyone at the Tesla organization can come in and take a look at that. So we'll talk about how to pull this off, because this is going to be a one-to-many type entity relationship, and you kind of see how all of this comes together. And we'll talk about different ways on how you can implement this, right? So that will be interesting once we get to that piece. Now, if you look at this in the bird's eye view, let me just pop this open in preview mode. This is the technology stack. Now, one of the things I would like to highlight for this particular solution is that this solution is going to have a custom form, a custom SharePoint form. So this is going to have a custom form on a SharePoint list for the admin. And then you're going to have the Canvas app, which is going to be another form that you can complete using the tablet layout or form factor. So you can use that, using the browser and the desktop, or either on the iPad. And then we're going to have another version of the application that's really meant for the service reps or the sales reps at the dealership, for those who are mobile, who are out and about, not really in front of a computer, but be able to get certain information about their clients assigned to them, or even get alerts or notifications if their clients like purchase another vehicle or take an existing vehicle to service and things like that. So we'll build that experience. Now, the key thing is I have all three of these Power Apps, but they all feed from the same SharePoint data source, right? And that's the beauty of the Power Platform in general, right? Because you have this decoupling of your form from the data source, and this could be SharePoint, Dataverse, Azure SQL, or whatever the case may be, but you have this decouple where, one, you can have many front doors, that's why I like to reference these, into the same data source, or you can have different experiences that add to this data source. It's just a beautiful, beautiful scenario to have. And then the Power Automate would kind of be the routing between the two. Now, again, the Power Automate and the SharePoint are going to be decoupled. So if there is a trigger on the SharePoint list that fires off an email, regardless of how that SharePoint list item was created, either through the form, the Canvas app, or even the mobile device, this piece of the process remains the same. And having this as an intermediary, regardless of or despite of calling the Power Automate directly from the Power Apps. And again, these are best practices and solution decisions that are made, because if you decouple this Power App from calling this Power Automate directly and go via a SharePoint list and then use the trigger to activate or trigger that flow, you get to keep these as microservices or independent. So it really doesn't matter how that item gets updated. I mean, I can update this item using the quick edit on this list or any one of these Power Apps, or even if I fire up a Microsoft form and have that right to the SharePoint list, either adding the item or updating an existing item, all this logic in the Power Automate still remains the same, and I don't need to replicate or duplicate that logic because the data came in a different door into the SharePoint list. Again, these are solution decisions that you make that, one, make sure solution is scalable and allows you to account for many different scenarios without having to duplicate logic. And then I think this is just the underpinning for most of us that's working in Power Apps or Power Platform in general. We understand that Azure Directory is kind of like the glue for any identity management as well as authentication, right? So this is going to be our core. In this particular scenario, we do not have an anonymous user, right? Sometimes we can fire up like a Microsoft form, make that anonymous, present that outside of the organization in order to collect data. Again, a super powerful scenario that you can do. But in this case, all of our users are going to be authenticated using Azure AD. And when we talk about clients, right, as far as client first name, last name, all of their address information, those clients will be considered outside of our Azure AD. So the Azure AD will represent the sales rep, the admin for this particular solution, maybe the service rep, or whatever the case may be. That's going to be those scenarios. So let's take a look at our entities that we're going to have in SharePoint. Again, this is 100% SharePoint solution. This will not have a Dataverse scenario or component to that. The intent for this is really meant to leverage as much as possible our seeded licensing for the Power Platform, and not to represent or not to take on any additional license requirement. So we know that with premium connectors, there's an additional license requirement. For Dataverse, because that's a premium data store, there's an additional licensing requirement when you're dealing with Dataverse outside of Microsoft Teams. So again, this solution is really meant to leverage our standard connectors, SharePoint as the data source, and then really just kind of use a little bit of elbow grease with formulas and expressions to kind of stay away from premium connectors. So if you look at these different entities here in the middle, the client is going to be the center of this universe, so to speak. You would notice that with this relationship with client vehicles, that's a one-to-many, so that clients can have more than one Tesla vehicle. When it comes to mapping the vehicle to the client, this is going to be that glue that kind of map the Model X, the Model 3, the Model S, and the Cybertruck XYZ to this user. So we're not duplicating some of those core attributes that come with the model in its generic form, right? The dealership, there may be a preferred dealership for this client. This is the one that they usually interact with when it comes to service, or if they have questions about their vehicle, this is the dealership that they go to. Or maybe if they're interested in another vehicle, they may interact with the sales rep from this particular dealership. Their sales reps will be tied to a dealership, so that's why you have these references here coming through these different paths. But for the client, they will be assigned a primary rep that will keep track of what they're working, dealing with, any questions that they may have, or any future purchases, even accessories, XYZ. And then we have the comments. And this is going to be our comments field that we represented on the comment screen. I think I actually skipped over that, but we'll go back and take a look at it. But again, as we mentioned before, no, I didn't skip it, how we can capture the comments and even log when emails are sent, or even log when the client took their vehicle in for service. So this, again, will be a one-to-many relationship. Now, this is what I will highly, highly recommend. When you're working with a solution, especially a solution that just is not simple as capture data, store it, or send an email notification, when you have these different components, if you look at solution like these different components where I can have one or many Power Apps interacting with this list and a whole family or suite of Power Automate, highly, highly recommend doing some type of solution diagram, entity diagram, as well as a list schema in Excel. And that's going to be this guy here. Now, and this is before I touch anything, right? This is before I create one line of code, one form, create any list or anything like that. I'm doing all of this paperwork up front, mostly to get the business users in alignment with, this is what we're going to build, this is the UI, this is the experience, get the dev team in alignment. These are the technical components that we plan to interact with. Our whole goal, right, you want to make this known up front, is to stay away from premium connectors when and where possible, to stay away from premium data repositories when and where possible. Our whole goal is to leverage our seeded account. So we do all this up front, and we kind of shop around. This is the schema. And I love this because if you make a mistake, it's easy to fix it and correct it here versus, wow, I just created 20 columns. I'm not going to change the column type to all 20. I'm going to live with the work that's been done, right? So here, even just building this out, you can see that I have, my different lists over here represented as sheets within this workbook. But, I can see where duplicates are. I can see where separation of concerns should be highlighted, right? Like, so how many, like you notice the scratch out here in my vehicles. At first, when I was listing this out, I was like, oh yeah, I need to have vehicles, but they can have more than one. And I started down this path of vehicle 2, vehicle 3, and quickly noticed that that was not scalable. So I knew I was going to have a vehicle list, but I wasn't sure where I was going to put the primary key to kind of tie the client vehicle list to the client list. So instead of having lookups here to the client vehicle list, I'm gonna actually do the same type of relationship, but store my primary key in the opposite direction, where I'm actually store the ID of the client here on the client vehicle list, and this sets me up to have that one-to-many. So in this scenario, the client is not aware of the vehicles that are tied to this record, but the client vehicle list is aware of the client, right? And that's how you create the one-to-many relationship. I had the same scenario here with comments, right? So on my client list, I don't have a comment ID because the relationship is on the other side. The comments list is going to have the ID of the client, though the client list is not aware of all of the various comments. Again, that's how I handle that one-to-many relationship. Outside of that, I think everything else is pretty straightforward. There was a decision made here, building this out. being very mindful of how to handle states. We knew we wanted to handle multiple countries, so I didn't want the states, or couldn't have the states as a choice column. They had to be a lookup, because that's going to be more of like a cascading type relationship. So now if I look at my country states, and the cascading became very simple. So here I'm gonna just have the title, again, reuse that. That was another thing, before I get into the country state scenario, this is another thing, recognizing that you're always dealing with that one column that you always have to reuse, right? And that's the primary column, if anything, on a SharePoint list, right? Because the title column, not only is it by default, but when you look at your link abilities and your edit command and your edit menus, all of that rides off of this column. So you want to not only just reuse it, but make it meaningful to where it represents the key column or key information for that particular record. So with all of these, I kind of struggled with trying to figure out how I'm going to reuse that title. Again, those are decisions that are easily identified if you're doing this in a bird's eye view in Excel versus jumping with both feet in and starting to build out your list. Okay, so with country states, very simple. The country is going to be the reuse of the title. The state, and this is this generic name, territory, because I know some countries represent their territories as province, others are states, and others are maybe areas or even territories. So this is going to give us that scalable view to where, for each territory, either state, province, or whatever the case may be, I'm going to just do a key value pair of country and territory, and that's going to be that. So when I come to the client, to get this state, the first thing I have to do is have them select which country this client is in, and then based off of that, I would build a list of states for the selected country. The dealership was pretty straightforward. I just knew that was going to be a lookup to this list here. Again, just representing the dealership by title, and understanding that the dealership can have other metadata. Now, this is another interesting one. I love the location site column type in SharePoint. It's fairly new compared to the other site columns that you have with the list. But the issue with the location is that it's not represented or fully supported yet in Power Apps, right? So if I'm building a custom form, or if I need to view, I think you can view the location column, but you cannot add data to it, or vice versa, or something weird about it. And by the time you get to building it, this may already be supported, so it may be a moot point. But just be careful, because with the location, it will come with address 1, address 2, city, state, and all this other fun stuff, as well as a Bing map to represent the location. Super duper convenient column. So I'm using location here, but notice when I'm in a client, because I know I'm gonna build a custom form to enter in this data and interact with this data, I actually exploded that out to individual columns to represent the location. Outside of that, I think everything else is pretty self-explanatory. Sales reps, again, this is going to be an Azure AD user, so I'm going to represent them by the person column. And I want to say that's it. Now, on paper, I think I have all my scenarios covered. When it comes to building, the expectation is this is your baseline. As you build things, you're going to come into different scenarios, or maybe utility columns, if you would, that just may be needed to kind of help with certain functionality, right? You may have to store a hidden value somewhere, or maybe when Power Automate to track a state or a status, you may need these hidden columns that are really not meant for the end user to populate, but really meant for just for the system to operate. So with all of that, the expectation is that this will change once we get into implementation mode, but it should be one of those things that we can absorb, right? And from a maintenance perspective, we should expect things to change. We should expect columns to be added, expect to update the Power App, expect to update the Power Automate, and we just want to make sure that whatever we build has a beautiful maintenance story and simple changes do not cost us days of or even rework. Okay, so that's going to be that. Now, how do we get started? And I'm going to actually wrap this segment of the video with this. Now, here is my recommendation. From my experience, I started out, let me tell you where I started. So when I built these types of solutions, what we would do, we would find like the sales site collection, navigate to the sales site collection, find what site they were working in, or even use the SharePoint site that came with a team that they were working in, and start to build our solution there within that existing site collection. Just through security, through maintenance, and to minimize confusion, I've since then graduated to every solution I build will have its own site. Now that can be its own subsite for that solution, or it could mean it has its own site collection, right? So let's just build this. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna just go to the main intranet site and go ahead and create a new subsite, and let's just call this the client. Let's just call it clients, or yeah, you just call it client. And I always, when I'm building a subsite, especially because I'm 100% dedicated and committed to modern SharePoint, all my subsites would be a team site with no Microsoft group versus the classic experience. And for this one, I always do unique permissions because I don't want anything that I'm working on to pop up in the search results because I inherit permissions from the parent and I'm still in development mode. I did not explicitly grant access to it. So this is why I always do unique permissions. And the other thing, from a navigation perspective, I want to have full control of when I want the site to appear in the top nav. So I'm going to say no to all of these and then go ahead and hit create. Once I do this, because I select unique permissions, the next screen is going to say, okay, what do you want to name these SharePoint groups? And here I want to make sure that I get unique groups for this subsite, and I don't need to leverage any of the existing parent groups or any of the existing groups within the site collection. So I think I'm good here. So I'm gonna just go ahead and click OK. So now I have my subsite. What I'm gonna do is go ahead and start to build out my list based on these columns and the various types that are needed. And that's where we're going to start our second video for this particular series. Okay, so hopefully we learned a lot together. There's a ton of tips and tricks, decisions that we're going to make along the way in order to build out this solution. And I think it's going to be very interesting and hopefully very enlightening on how to tackle a lot of these different common scenarios. All right. Any questions, go ahead and leave me a comment in the comments field. Until then, I'll catch you in the next video, and take care of yourself.